It was a chilly autumn evening in the small rural town of White River, South Dakota. The town had always been quiet, with not much happening except the occasional storm or a local festival. My younger brother Austin and I grew up in a modest countryside home, which was just big enough for our small family. Our mom worked night shifts as a nurse at the local hospital, and our dad lived out of state due to his job, only visiting us a couple of times a month. Most nights when Mom worked, our grandma would stay over to look after us. Our house, while small, was cozy. There were 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a living room, and a kitchen that opened into a spacious dining room. My bedroom was in the middle of the hall, Austin's next to mine, and Mom's room at the very end. Grandma always slept in Mom's room whenever she stayed over. That night, Grandma and I were in the living room. She was watching TV while I played with my Legos. It was a typical evening. Austin had already gone to bed. I wasn't scared of the dark or strange noises. I had never believed in the paranormal. Grandma, on the other hand, kept telling me to quiet down, worried I'd wake up Austin. Finally, it was time for bed, and like always, Grandma kissed me goodnight before heading to bed herself. The night was still, and everything was normal. I remember falling asleep quickly, feeling safe and comfortable in my bed. But in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I was startled because I usually slept like a rock, barely waking up for anything. But tonight, I heard a creaking noise from outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought Grandma was just going to the bathroom. The house's wooden floors always creaked whenever someone walked down the hall. The creaking didn't stop. It sounded like footsteps moving back and forth in the hallway, as if someone was pacing nervously. Confused, I got out of bed and quietly approached my door, trying to listen. Then, to my horror, I heard something else. A faint voice, barely audible, but definitely there. It wasn't clear what was being said, but I could make out some kind of mumbling, a soft, eerie voice that didn't belong to anyone in the house. My first thought was that Grandma was talking to Austin, maybe checking on him. But something didn't feel right. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly opened the door, just enough to peek out into the hallway. And that's when I saw her. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, just a few feet away, was a woman I had never seen before. She was in her 30s, dressed in a long white dress, her dark hair hanging limply around her face. She wasn't looking at me yet, but the sight of her sent chills down my spine. She leaned against the wall, her face buried in her arms, muttering softly to herself. The words weren't clear, but there was something sinister about the way she whispered, something that made my stomach churn. Suddenly, as if sensing my gaze, she snapped her head around and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with something dark and malevolent. Her face twisted into an unnatural grin as she stared at me. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed away, shaking uncontrollably, but before I could think of what to do, I heard her footsteps approaching my door. Then came the pounding, violent, forceful bangs against the wood, followed by her voice, shrieking my name. "Alex, open the door! Let me in!" she screamed, her voice filled with rage and desperation. I was terrified. I screamed for my grandma as loudly as I could. The pounding continued, the woman's voice growing louder and more insistent. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in fear. I heard her laugh, a high-pitched, deranged sound that sent shivers down my spine. Then, from the hallway, I heard Grandma's voice. She was shouting at the woman, her tone fierce and protective. "Get the hell out of here!" Grandma yelled. I could hear her approaching, her footsteps quick and determined. "You can't stop me!" the woman screamed back. "I've come to take Alex with me." Hearing those words made my blood run cold. I felt my legs buckle beneath me, my hands trembling as I clung to the bedpost. Why did she want me? Who was she? Grandma was in her 60s, but she was still spry. Without hesitation, she grabbed a baseball bat from the hallway closet and charged at the woman. I heard the scuffle, the sounds of the woman screaming as she was forced to retreat. Finally, the door slammed, and everything went silent. Grandma locked the doors and windows and immediately called the police. When they arrived, they searched the house thoroughly but found nothing. They discovered footprints inside the hallway, but bizarrely, the tracks disappeared once they reached the yard, despite the wet ground outside. It was as if the woman had vanished into thin air. The officers were baffled, but assured us that they would keep an eye on the area. For the next couple of days, we lived in constant fear. Nothing happened for 2 nights, but we couldn't shake the terror that had gripped us. On the 3rd night, the pounding returned, but this time it wasn't just the woman at the door. There were knocks and bangs from all around the house, on the windows, on the walls, and even from within the house itself. The woman's voice echoed through the house, calling my name again and again, demanding that I come to her. This time, my mom was home. She had taken a week off work after the first incident. She and Grandma locked Austin and me in my room while they armed themselves with baseball bats, ready to defend us. Mom couldn't handle it anymore. After another sleepless night of terror, she decided we had to leave. Within a week, we packed up and moved to a different town. Grandma stayed with us, unwilling to let us out of her sight. We never saw the woman in white again, but I've never forgotten her. To this day, I can still hear her voice calling my name in the dead of night, and I often wonder what would have happened if Grandma hadn't been there to protect me that first night. The house in White River was sold soon after we left, but I often wonder if the new owners ever experienced anything strange. Whoever that woman was, whatever she wanted, she wasn't human, and the thought of her still haunts me. I'll never forget her twisted grin, her icy voice, and the way she whispered that she had come to take me with her. It happened 6 years ago when I was about 22, but the experience still sends chills down my spine. Even now, the memory is vivid, etched deep in my mind. It was the 15th of June, and I had the house to myself. My parents were on vacation in Spain, so I had been relishing the quiet time alone. That evening, around 8 p.m., the heat was unbearable. I remember sweating profusely in my tank top and shorts, feeling as if the walls were radiating warmth. To cool down the house, I opened all the windows in the living room and bedroom, hoping the night air would bring some relief. Exhaustion tugged at me, though. I had attended college that morning and played a grueling volleyball match in the afternoon, so my body was screaming for rest. After a quick dinner, I collapsed onto my bed without even realizing it, drifting off almost instantly. I woke up sometime around 4 a.m. to the distant rumble of thunder and a cool breeze hitting my face. The intense heat from earlier had subsided, replaced by a growing chill as the storm loomed closer. My curtains flapped wildly in the wind, and I could hear the shutters banging against the windows. Groggily, I reached for the bedside lamp, but it wouldn't turn on. Great, a power outage, I muttered to myself. I checked the plug, but it was fine. My phone's flashlight had to do the trick, so I shined it around the room, half blinded by sleep. Outside, the sky was a menacing, swirling mass of black clouds. The streetlights were out, confirming my suspicion that there was a blackout in the neighborhood. The wind was howling now, whistling through the trees and shaking the windows. The storm was intensifying, and I knew I had to shut the windows before the rain hit. Still drowsy, I stumbled down the hallway, flashlight in hand, to close the windows. As I reached the living room, I noticed something odd. The mosquito net on one of the windows was lifted. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I hadn't left it like that. The logical part of me tried to rationalize it. The wind, I told myself, maybe it was strong enough to push the net up, but something about it felt off. Feeling uneasy, I glanced around the living room, scanning it with the flashlight. The furniture was undisturbed, nothing seemed out of place. Maybe I was being paranoid. I had checked everything, and there was no reason to suspect anything wrong. After all, I was just exhausted, probably imagining things. I shut the windows, telling myself to relax and go back to bed. But as I turned to leave the living room, something caught my eye. At the top of the stairs leading to the attic, a bright flash of light illuminated the room. For a second, I dismissed it as lightning. After all, a storm was brewing. But then, something felt off. The light was too vivid, too concentrated, and there had been no sound of thunder. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. That wasn't lightning. Could it have been a flashlight? My stomach churned with fear as the realization dawned on me. Someone could be in the house. I stood there frozen, my mind racing with possibilities. Had they heard me closing the windows? Were they armed? Did they just want to rob the place, or was something more sinister at play? I knew I had to act fast. My parents weren't around to help, and the situation was spiraling out of control. Just then, the sound of a doorknob turning caught my attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the flashlight towards the living room entrance. Through the glass-paneled door, I saw the silhouette of a man standing just outside the front door. There was someone else with him, his accomplice, no doubt. A surge of panic shot through me. I felt utterly powerless. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I knew I had to stay calm. Moving as quietly as possible, I tiptoed towards the basement stairs, my phone still lighting my way. The basement connected directly to the garage, and I figured it would be my best escape route. With shaking hands, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, explaining what was happening. The operator tried to reassure me, telling me to stay calm and that the police were on their way. She advised me to lock myself in a safe room until help arrived. I was about to respond when the call dropped. Panic surged through me. I glanced at my phone, realizing I had lost signal in the basement. To make things worse, my battery was almost dead. I made my way to the garage, my gut telling me I was being watched. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't shake it. When I turned my flashlight towards my car, my blood ran cold. Sitting in the back seat, staring at me through the rearview mirror, was a man. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he was looking straight through me. His yellow grin stretched unnaturally across his face, and he waved at me slowly, as if mocking my fear. I froze, terror paralyzing my body. Before I could react, my phone battery died, plunging me into complete darkness. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I heard the car door creak open. My body moved on instinct. I bolted for the garage door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. As I heard footsteps behind me, I finally managed to unlock it and sprinted outside into the storm. By now, the rain was pouring down in sheets, and the wind howled even louder. I ran to my neighbor's house, screaming for help. My clothes were soaked, and I could barely catch my breath as I pounded on their door. They opened up, startled by my frantic state, and I quickly explained what had happened. In the distance, I heard sirens. Finally, the police were arriving. 2 patrol cars sped down the street, and I ran towards them, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. I told the officers everything, still trembling from the ordeal. The police wasted no time. 4 of them entered the house with guns drawn, while another stayed behind to take my statement. I waited anxiously, praying they would find the intruders. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. The house was empty. The men were gone. They had taken some valuable antiques, but thankfully, that was the extent of the damage. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind sent me into a state of panic. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering how close I had come to something far worse. The next morning, I found something that chilled me to my core. On the edge of my bed, there was a small piece of paper. Written on it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Bye-bye, beauty. You look cute when you sleep." My heart stopped. They had been in my room while I slept. I immediately handed the note to the police, and the investigation took a sharp turn. The officers carefully placed the slip of paper into an evidence bag and assured me they would dust it for fingerprints. The fact that the intruders had been bold enough to enter my bedroom while I slept made my skin crawl. I could barely stand still as the police combed through my home for more clues, searching every inch of the house for anything the men might have left behind. My sense of safety had been completely shattered. The next day, the forensics team called with news. They had found clear fingerprints on the note. One of the officers explained that the prints matched those of a known career criminal, someone with a long rap sheet for burglary and home invasion. He was part of a trio of thieves who had been terrorizing the surrounding neighborhoods for months, targeting homes late at night when the owners were either away or fast asleep. It became clear that my home wasn't chosen at random. It was a deliberate, well-planned break-in. The police, now knowing who they were dealing with, devised a plan to catch the criminals once and for all. They didn't want to risk spooking them or having them slip through their fingers again. So they proposed a trap, one that would lure the trio back to my neighborhood, where they would be waiting. For the next week, my house remained under close surveillance. Plainclothes officers were stationed in cars parked discreetly around the block, while others kept watch from nearby houses. The police even encouraged me to leave my windows slightly ajar, just as they had been the night of the break-in, to make it seem like I was still a vulnerable target. It felt like bait, but I trusted the police. They assured me that they had everything under control. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that something would go wrong. Every night, I slept fitfully, waking up at every creak and gust of wind. What if they didn't come back? What if they decided to target someone else? Worse, what if they knew the police were waiting and tried to retaliate? The tension was unbearable. Finally, on the 7th night, it happened. Just after midnight, one of the officers on stakeout radioed in. They had spotted a dark van creeping down the street with its headlights off. It pulled to a stop a few houses away from mine. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched from the safe house next door, where the police had relocated me for the night. They whispered updates to me as the events unfolded. 3 figures emerged from the van, moving swiftly and quietly. They wore dark hoodies and gloves, and their faces were partially obscured by scarves. As they approached my house, one of them took out a flashlight, flicking it on and off quickly, as if signaling to the others. They were clearly professionals. They worked with a terrifying precision, like predators stalking their prey. The police were ready. They let the intruders get close, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One of the men climbed the front steps of my house, while the other 2 circled around to the backyard, just as they had done during the first break-in. The officer in charge of the operation, who was monitoring the scene from a nearby surveillance van, gave the signal. In an instant, the quiet night erupted into chaos. Floodlights flicked on, illuminating the house and the surrounding area. Officers burst from their hiding spots, shouting commands for the intruders to freeze. Startled, the men bolted in different directions, trying to flee. One ran towards the backyard fence, scrambling to climb over it, while another darted down the side of the house, heading for the street. The third man, the one who had been closest to the front door, hesitated for a split second, realizing he was trapped. He turned to run, but it was too late. 2 officers tackled him to the ground, pinning him down as he struggled and cursed. The others weren't so lucky either. The man trying to scale the fence was brought down by an officer who had been stationed on the other side, waiting for just such an escape attempt. He fought back, kicking and swinging his arms wildly, but within moments, the officer had him handcuffed and subdued. The final intruder, the one who had fled towards the street, made it to the sidewalk and sprinted towards the van. He was fast, faster than the officers chasing him, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might actually get away. But just as he reached the van, tires screeched, and 2 patrol cars blocked his path. Realizing he had no way out, he raised his hands in surrender, collapsing to his knees as the officers moved in to arrest him. It was over. The trio had been caught. I watched the entire thing unfold from the safe house, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone. I couldn't believe it was finally happening. The men who had terrorized me, who had invaded my home, left that horrifying note, and shattered my sense of security, were now in police custody. Later that night, after the adrenaline had worn off and the police had processed the scene, they brought me to the station to formally identify the intruders. I stood behind a one-way mirror, watching as the 3 men sat in handcuffs, their faces contorted with anger and frustration. They weren't so terrifying now, sitting there powerless, awaiting their fate. The leader of the group, the man whose fingerprints had been found on the note, glared at the officers, defiant until the very end. But there was nothing he could do now. The police had them dead to rights. Fingerprints, the stolen items from my house, and now the botched break-in, all captured on video. They were charged with multiple counts of burglary, home invasion, and possession of stolen property. For me, the nightmare was finally over. But even after they were sentenced and sent to prison, the memory of that night lingered. The feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had been inside my home while I slept, haunted me for months. I installed new locks, got a security system, and moved to a different neighborhood, hoping to leave the fear behind. Yet, even now, 6 years later, I still catch myself checking the windows before bed, making sure every door is locked, every curtain drawn. I still get chills when I hear a creak in the house late at night, and I can't shake the sense that somewhere out there, someone might be watching. Someone might be watching. Night of Terror. It was a cool autumn evening, and the sprawling mansion of the Fernandez family sat eerily still on the edge of their quiet, affluent neighborhood in St. Moritz, Switzerland. High walls surrounded the house, and a lone security guard, Jonas, patrolled the gates. Inside, 17-year-old Marissa Fernandez and her 12-year-old brother, Adrian, were spending the night with their 60-year-old aunt, Claudette, while their parents were away on a vacation in the Maldives. The house, usually filled with laughter and voices, now felt silent and foreboding. Marissa was in her room on the second floor, video chatting with a friend, while Adrian played video games in the living room downstairs. Aunt Claudette, who had come to keep an eye on the kids, was quietly knitting on the couch beside him, occasionally glancing at the television. Jonas, outside the gates, had just finished a quick round of checks when something strange caught his attention. 3 men approached the front gate, all dressed in black from head to toe. Their faces were obscured by ski masks, and they moved with precision, clearly having scoped out the house beforehand. Jonas was about to raise the alarm when one of the men pulled out a stun gun. Before Jonas could react, the jolt hit him. His body convulsed, and he collapsed onto the gravel, unable to scream. They quickly gagged him, tied him up, and dragged him behind a bush, hidden from view. The men, one tall and broad, the second average in height but with a calculating look in his eyes, and the third stocky with a muscular build, were prepared. They picked the gate's lock with expertise and crept through the garden silently. The plan was simple: kidnap Adrian, demand a ransom, and disappear. The Fernandez family was one of the wealthiest in the country, and the kidnappers knew their demands would be met. Inside, Marissa had finished her call and was lying on her bed, scrolling through social media. The house was quiet, save for the soft clinking of Aunt Claudette's knitting needles and the distant sounds of Adrian's video game downstairs. Marissa sighed, feeling an odd sense of unease. Maybe it was the vast emptiness of the house, or maybe it was just her nerves, but something felt wrong. She dismissed the feeling and continued scrolling. The intruders moved toward the house with silent precision. They found a side door that led to the kitchen, and with a small crowbar, they pried it open. The door swung inward, and the men slipped inside like shadows. Once inside, they crouched, moving stealthily through the darkened house. Marissa, upstairs, suddenly heard a faint creak. It was barely audible, but enough to make her sit up. Her heart skipped a beat, and she strained to hear more. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then another creak, followed by a soft shuffle. Someone was inside the house. She quickly swung her legs off the bed and crept to her door, opening it slightly. From the upstairs hallway, she could hear faint voices coming from downstairs, low, hushed tones. Her pulse quickened. She tiptoed to the top of the staircase and glanced down. Through the dim light filtering in from the windows, she could see 3 men moving through the house, one of them whispering harshly to the others. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. She quickly ducked back into the shadows, her mind racing. She needed to warn Aunt Claudette and Adrian. The intruders were in the house, and from the way they moved, they weren't here to rob them. They were here for something else, something far worse. She rushed back to her room and grabbed her phone, dialing Aunt Claudette's number. The phone rang, and downstairs, Aunt Claudette picked it up. "Marissa, what is it?" "Aunt Claudette," Marissa whispered urgently. "There are men in the house, 3 of them. They're downstairs." Aunt Claudette froze, her knitting slipping from her hands. She glanced at Adrian, who was still engrossed in his game, oblivious to the danger. "Stay calm, Marissa," she whispered back. "I'll get Adrian. We'll find a place to hide. Don't come down." Aunt Claudette stood up quietly and crossed the room to Adrian, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Adrian, honey," she said softly, "pause your game. We need to go upstairs now." Adrian frowned. "Why? What's going on?" "There's no time to explain. Just trust me, she urged, her voice trembling slightly. Come on. Reluctantly, Adrian followed her, sensing the urgency in her voice. They crept up the stairs, where Marissa was waiting, her face pale with fear. What are we going to do? Adrian whispered, his eyes wide. Marissa motioned for them to follow her into her bedroom. We need to hide and figure out a way to call for help, she said, locking the door behind them. The intruders, I think they're after Adrian. I overheard them talking. Aunt Claudette's face went pale. They want to kidnap him, she muttered, for ransom. We need to stay quiet, Marissa said, looking around the room for a hiding spot. We can't let them find us. They quickly hid Adrian under the bed, while Aunt Claudette and Marissa positioned themselves behind the large wardrobe. They could hear the intruders moving through the house, their footsteps getting louder as they neared the stairs. One of the men, the stocky one, growled in a low voice, "Find the boy. The faster we get him, the faster we're out of here." The sound of heavy boots echoed up the stairs as the men approached. Marissa's heart pounded so loudly she feared it would give them away. She held her breath, gripping Aunt Claudette's hand tightly as the door handle rattled. "Ah, ah." The door creaked open, and the intruders stepped inside. Marissa peeked through the narrow gap between the wardrobe and the wall, watching as the men scanned the room. The tall one glanced under the bed, but missed seeing Adrian, who was curled up tightly in the shadows. "We'll split up," the broad man said. "Check every room." They left the room, and Marissa exhaled a shaky breath. "We need to get out," she whispered. "If we stay here, they'll find us eventually." Aunt Claudette nodded. "There's a window that leads to the roof in the attic," she said. "We can try to escape that way." Quietly, they helped Adrian out from under the bed and moved toward the attic, tiptoeing past the rooms as the intruders searched the house. When they reached the attic, Marissa unlocked the small window, and they climbed out onto the sloped roof. The wind howled, and the night air chilled them to the bone, but they had no choice. They had to escape. Just as they started to climb down the roof, the tall intruder spotted them. "They're on the roof," he shouted, alerting the others. A chase ensued. The intruders scrambled outside, trying to follow them. Marissa led the way down, helping Adrian and Aunt Claudette. They ran toward the neighbor's house, but the stocky intruder was gaining on them fast. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The neighbors, having seen the commotion, had called the police. Blue and red lights flashed, and within moments, several police cars surrounded the house. The intruders, caught off guard, tried to flee, but the police were quick to act. "Freeze!" shouted one of the officers, gun drawn. The intruders attempted to scatter, but it was too late. The police tackled them to the ground and handcuffed them. Marissa, Adrian, and Aunt Claudette watched from the neighbor's driveway, their hearts still pounding from the terror. The leader of the intruders, the tall man, cursed under his breath as he was dragged into a squad car. "You got lucky, kid," he spat at Adrian, "but we'll be back." The officer shook his head. "Not anytime soon," he said, slamming the door. As the police took the criminals away, Marissa finally exhaled in relief. She hugged Adrian tightly, grateful that they were safe. Aunt Claudette wiped a tear from her eye, her hands still trembling from the ordeal. That night, as the police took their statements, Marissa realized how close they had come to disaster. The intruders' plan had failed, but the memory of their cold, calculated intent would stay with her forever. Even though they were safe now, the shadow of that night lingered, a reminder that sometimes danger lurks where you least expect it. The neighbors, who had come to their rescue, comforted the shaken family. And while the ordeal was finally over, Marissa, Adrian, and Aunt Claudette knew they would never forget the night they fought for their lives.